The Crusades cannot be understood without having some understanding of the prehistory of the Crusades, the rise of Islam, and the early conflicts between Islam and Christianity. The Europeans didn't just wake up one day and decide to march on Jerusalem. Viewers may be surprised to learn that the Crusaders never viewed themselves as invading Muslim lands, but rather as responding to the much earlier and more significant Muslim invasions of Christian lands. The history here is long and rich, and I clearly cannot do justice to it in this video, but I will endeavor to mention the highlights in order to contextualize the events leading up to the First Crusade. It may be helpful to begin our investigation of the Crusades by first settling on a definition of the term. Let us begin by distinguishing between a crusade and the Crusades. A crusade can colloquially refer to any sort of mission that is seen as being good or righteous. As Alfred Andrea observes, this latter notion of the Crusaders' inherent nobility and lack of self-interest was inspiration for the transformation of the word crusade into a generic term that today is used to designate any idealistic enterprise that aims to achieve a social good. It is also employed as a metaphor for a struggle against evil. Similarly, Christopher Tyerman says, the word crusade, a non-medieval Franco-Spanish hybrid, only popularized in English since the 18th century, has entered the Anglo-American language as a synonym for a good cause vigorously pursued, from pacific Christian evangelism to militant temperance. More narrowly, a crusade may refer to any sort of war that is seen as holy or as fought on behalf of God. Things become trickier when we move from defining a crusade to trying to clearly define the Crusades. Viewers may be interested to learn that the term crusade is relatively modern. Those who participated in the wars that have come to be known as the Crusades did not refer to them by this term. Perhaps one might think that we can refer to them as the series of wars between 1096 and 1291 waged by Western Christendom against Muslims. The difficulty with this definition is that there seem to be clear examples of crusades, such as the Albigensian Crusade or the Northern Crusades, which were not fought against Muslims at all, and many of these putative crusades lasted far beyond the collapse of the Crusader states in the Holy Land in 1291. Furthermore, prior to the so-called First Crusade, there were very similar wars fought against the Muslims in the name of God in Spain, which, perhaps, also ought to be considered crusades. Historians cannot even agree on the number of crusades in the Holy Land. Tyerman explains how messy of a business it can be trying to define the historical crusades when he says, between 1095 and, say, 1500, there were scores of military operations that attracted the privileges associated with the Wars of the Cross, yet only a few later became known by a number, all of them aimed at Muslim targets in and around Syria and Palestine in the eastern Mediterranean. Obviously the nobles, knights, foot soldiers, unarmed pilgrims, and hangers-on who answered Urban II's appeal in 1095 through 1096 did not know that they were embarking on the first of anything. Subsequent events altered perceptions. The promoters of the next comparable Eastern campaign in 1146 through 1149 invoked the precedent of 1095 through 1096, casting into shadow smaller expeditions that had embarked to aid the Christian cause in the East in the interim. Thus, in the eyes of later scholars, the 1146 Crusade became the Second Crusade. Subsequent numbering followed suit, attached only to general, large-scale international assaults intended to reach the Holy Land. hence the inclusion in the canon of the Fourth Crusade that planned to attack Egypt, although getting no further than Constantinople. Other crusades are defined by objective, location, participants, or motive. Hence, the Albigensian Crusades describe the wars against religious heretics in southern France around Albi between 1209 and 1229. The Baltic Crusades were campaigns launched against local pagan tribes of the region for 2.5 centuries from the mid-12th century. The Peasants', Children's, and Shepherds' Crusades speak for themselves. To add to the confusion, even within the canon, historians have disagreed over some numbers attached to Holy Land Crusades in the 13th century. Most modern historians, content to number crusades until the 5th, beginning in 1213, thereafter dispense with numbering. If we begin by analyzing the clearest putative examples of wars that were crusades, then we can abstract some necessary conditions that can aid us in arriving at a more adequate definition of the term. The clearest putative examples of crusades share in common the idea that it was European Christians waging war against non-Christians, or at least heretical Christian groups, at the behest of the Pope, in the name of God, and in the defense of Christendom. Again, Andrea correctly says, in the eyes of the popes, cardinals, bishops, theologians, canon lawyers, preachers, and polemicists of the 13th century church, a legitimate crusade was a just and holy war called by the Roman papacy and fought in defense of Christendom against an unbelieving aggressor, be that person a Muslim, a heretic, or a pagan. Christopher Tyerman, perhaps today's foremost crusade historian, gives us a more precise definition as follows. What we today call a crusade could be described as a war answering God's command, authorized by a legitimate authority, the Pope, who, by virtue of the power seen as vested in him as Vicar of Christ, identified the war's object and offered to those who undertook it full remission of the penalties of confessed sins and a package of related temporal privileges. I think that Tyerman's definition is mostly fine, but I propose a couple slight modifications. The first would be that we stipulate that a crusade is defined in terms of being proclaimed and believed to answer the call of God. In this way, we avoid begging any questions against those who either do not believe in God or do not believe that God has ever commanded a crusade. I would further suggest that we downgrade Tyerman's condition of a legitimate authority to a putative authority so as to avoid begging crucial questions against those with reservations about the legitimacy of the Pope's authority. Our resulting definition of a crusade thus requires the fulfillment of 5 conditions. These are 1. A war fought in defense of or on behalf of Christendom. 2. A war that is fought against non-Christians or, at the very least, heretical Christians. 3. A war that is claimed and believed to be fought at the command of God. 4. A war that is proclaimed by the Pope. And 5. A war that is undertaken by those who have taken sacred vows and have been promised spiritual rewards. The historical events that qualify as crusades, then, are the wars which meet these 5 conditions. They include the Spanish Reconquista, the First, Second, Third, and Fifth Crusades, a handful of other crusades to the Holy Land, whose numbering is controversial, the Northern Crusades in the Baltic and Eastern Europe, the Albigensian Crusade in France, and several lesser-known crusades scattered throughout the rest of Europe and the larger medieval world. Undoubtedly, the movement of crusading, despite not exclusively applying to wars against Muslims, as we have seen, was nevertheless brought about by Islam. For the remainder of this video, therefore, I want to detail some of the prehistory leading up to the First Crusade in 1096. To understand why these wars were waged in the first place, it is necessary to explore the earlier clashes between Christendom and Islam. To understand why tens of thousands of medieval Europeans chose to leave their homeland and embark on a dangerous journey east in the name of God, we need to have some understanding of the Islamic faith against which they positioned themselves. Islam, contrary to what is commonly believed, refers not to peace, but rather to submission to the will of Allah, the Islamic conception of God. It is important for viewers to understand that imperialistic conquest is built into Islam in a way that it is not built into almost any other religion. It is one of the doctrines of Islam that the religion will spread to the whole world, and that Muslims, as part of their submission to Allah, are to assist in spreading it to the whole world by violent force if necessary. This is part of the doctrine of jihad. Muslims are obligated by their own religious beliefs to quite literally conquer the world. Of course, this is not to suggest that all Muslims are radicals who are actively engaged in attempting a global conquest, but it is to say that Islam provides an incentive structure and justification for this sort of behavior. As Efraim Karsh puts it, I was ordered to fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah. With these farewell words, the Prophet Muhammad summed up the international vision of the faith he had brought to the world. As a universal religion, Islam envisages a global political order in which all humankind will live under Muslim rule as either believers or subject communities. In order to achieve this goal, it is incumbent on all free male adult Muslims to carry out an uncompromising struggle in the path of Allah, or jihad. This, in turn, makes those parts of the world that have not yet been conquered by the House of Islam an abode of permanent conflict, which will only end with Islam's eventual triumph. In the meantime, there can be no peace between these two world systems, only temporary suspensions of hostilities for reasons of necessity or expediency. Raymond Ibrahim adds, whereas most world civilizations have been able to slew off their historic tribalism and enter into modernity, to break with tribalism, for Muslims, is to break with Muhammad and his laws, to break with cardinal Islamic teachings. While it is true that Christianity is similarly committed to the idea that Jesus will one day rule the earth as king, and that Christians are to be active in the work of evangelism, Christianity provides no incentive whatsoever for Christians to bring this about by military force. If anything, it does precisely the opposite. While, as I argued in my last video, Christianity isn't necessarily a pacifistic religion, it is nevertheless committed to doctrines that are intended to restrain the more violent impulses to which human beings are prone. Turn the other cheek, love your neighbor as yourself, do not resist evil but overcome evil with good, and so on and so forth. Jesus was not a warrior, and for centuries, his followers were a persecuted minority with no real political or military power. It was not until the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in 312 AD that Christians began to have to wrestle with the idea of how to reconcile their Christian beliefs with the military obligations required to sustain an empire. The origins of Islam could not have been more different. It was an imperialistic warrior faith nearly from its inception. The origins of Islam may be found in the teachings of the supposed Prophet Muhammad. Both in his teachings and in his deeds, he exemplified the doctrine of jihad. As Steve Weidenkopf puts it, Muhammad laid the foundation for the Crusades when, at the end of his life, he instructed his followers to fight all men until they say there is no God but Allah. This statement was later written into the Quran as, "Fight those who believe not in God." During his life, Muhammad embodied these words in his campaigns against fellow Arabs as well as against Jews. Muhammad's militaristic teachings and actions set the example for his followers who sought to emulate the jihad undertaken by the Prophet. Efraim Karsh adds, "The worlds of Christianity and Islam, however, have developed differently in one fundamental respect. The Christian faith won over an existing empire in an extremely slow and painful process, and its universalism was originally conceived in purely spiritual terms that made a clear distinction between God and Caesar. By the time it was embraced by the Byzantine emperors as a tool for buttressing their imperial claims 3 centuries after its foundation, Christianity had in place a countervailing ecclesiastical institution with an abiding authority over the wills and actions of all believers. The birth of Islam, by contrast, was inextricably linked with the creation of a world empire, and its universalism was inherently imperialistic." Of course, this militant perspective hardly originated with Muhammad. It was part of the Arab culture into which he was born. While Muhammad may not have created this warrior culture, he did create the catalyst in the form of the Islamic faith that would unite the Arab world into a military superpower, which, in just a few short centuries, would be pounding at the gates of medieval Europe. As Paul Crawford explains, despite the argument that Islam has historically been a religion of peace, warfare was central to the spread of Islam in the Middle East and Mediterranean, conceptually as well as historically. Pre-Islamic Arab culture was predicated to a significant degree on raiding, known as razzias, and warfare in ways similar to that of pre-Christian Viking culture. Islam emerged in a violent context and expanded with even more violence. In many ways, Muhammad appears as a warrior chieftain despite his religious message. Indeed, Muhammad personally participated in, or sanctioned, no fewer than 86 military campaigns or raids against various opponents, including Jews, pagans, and Byzantine Christians, as he and his early followers established political control over the Arabian Peninsula. Because Islam theoretically forbids warfare between Muslims, for the deeply entrenched razzia tradition of Arabia to continue, raiding activity had to be turned against non-Muslims. Efraim Karsh adds, Muhammad initially devised the concept of jihad, exertion in the path of Allah, as he called his God, as a means to entice his local followers to raid Meccan caravans, instantaneously transforming a common tribal practice into a supreme religious duty, and the primary vehicle for the spread of Islam throughout the ages. He developed and amplified this concept with the expansion of his political ambitions until it became a rallying call for world dominion, and he established the community of believers, or the Ummah, as the political framework for the practice of this religion in all territories it conquered. In doing so, Muhammad at once tapped into the Middle East millenarian legacy and ensured its perpetuation for many centuries to come. From the first Arab Islamic empire of the mid-7th century to the Ottomans, the last great Muslim empire, the story of Islam has been the story of the rise and fall of universal empires and, no less important, of never quiescent imperialist dreams. Politics, during this lengthy period, was characterized by a constant struggle for regional, if not world, mastery, in which the dominant power sought to subdue and preferably to eliminate all potential challengers. Raymond Ibrahim similarly concludes that Muhammad had only won over some 100 followers after a decade of peaceful preaching in Mecca, but nearly the whole of Arabia after a decade of successful raiding, an average of no fewer than 9 campaigns annually, speaks for itself. It is well worth asking the question of why, given the aggressive militant expansion of Islam from its very inception, it took 4 whole centuries for Europe to finally strike back against it. Plausibly, it is precisely because of the restraining effects of Christian doctrine against the worst impulses of human beings. Unlike in Islam, the idea of holy war was something that had to be carefully developed over centuries within Christianity in order to sufficiently accommodate the peace-oriented doctrines of the Christian faith. As Weidenkopf points out, this Christian understanding of holy war differs greatly from the Muslim teaching on jihad. Jihad is incumbent upon all Muslims and is a foundational teaching of Islam. Christian holy war is not incumbent on every believer. Indeed, participation in the Crusades was always voluntary, and violence is seen as a necessary evil that could only be entered into for serious and just reasons. Christian teaching even places restrictions on the nature of warfare and on the intentions of those who participate. Jihad harbors no such limitations. The main purpose of jihad is offensive through the conquering of territory in order to spread Islam throughout the world. Christian holy war is defensive and primarily involves the recovery of territory lost to an aggressor. And Darío Fernández-Morera adds, attempts to equate jihad with crusade do not withstand analysis. For devout Christians, the sacred war of a crusade was a unique event that only a pope could proclaim. But as Ibn Khaldun pointed out, for devout Muslims, the sacred war of jihad was a permanent state of being decreed by Islamic law that the caliph must wage at least once a year. Once Islam took root, it spread rapidly across Arabia and then into surrounding territories at a frightening pace. While modern people tend to think of Europeans, and more recently Americans, as being the dominant forces throughout world history, in the early Middle Ages, that would have been a preposterous proposal. At that time, Muslims seemed poised to fulfill Muhammad's prediction that Islam would indeed rule the world. The Muslims entered Europe, conquered parts of Italy, most of Spain, and even pressed into France. All of this was justified by the Islamic doctrine of jihad. As Raymond Ibrahim explains, even among less ideologically charged historians, the macrocosmic significance of the aforementioned millennium, when Christian Europe was under constant threat from Islam, is unintelligible. They talk of Arab, Moorish, Ottoman, or Tatar, rarely Islamic, invasions and conquests, even though the self-same rationale, jihad, impelled those otherwise diverse peoples to assault the West. In fact, the effects of the early Muslim conquests of the Christian world are actually still felt to this day in the very way that we modern industrialized people refer to ourselves. Most of us living in first world countries today refer to our culture as Western culture. This term, or label, is itself a consequence of the conquest of the eastern segment of the Old World by Islam, and of the survival of the western segment of the Old World. The West was the portion of the known world that held out against and stood up to Islam. Again, Ibrahim says, "What is now referred to as the West was, for centuries, known and demarcated by the territorial extent of its religion, hence the older and more cohesive term, Christendom. It included the lands of the old Roman Empire, parts of Europe, all of North Africa, Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor, which had become Christian centuries before Islam arrived, and were part of the same overarching civilization. In other words, the West is what remained of Christendom after Islam conquered some 3/4 of its original territory. Simply put, the West is actually the westernmost remnant of what was a much more extensive civilizational bloc that Islam permanently severed. This is significant, inasmuch as the Middle East and North Africa are today culturally worlds apart from Europe. Had Islam not interrupted the organic continuity and territorial integrity of Christendom, the classical Mediterranean would likely have remained part of the same civilization. Though accurate in other ways then, the term the West shortchanges its own history with, and truncation by, Islam. It further implies that, although its eastern lands conquered by Islam were never part of Western civilization, when, in fact, they were the original inheritors of its Greco-Roman and Christian heritage. How to explain the rapidness of the expansion of early Islam is one of the most perennial questions in history. Islam appeared to be unstoppable, but then something happened. In the year 732, under the leadership of Charles Martel, nicknamed Charles the Hammer, the Franks decisively stopped the Muslim incursion into Europe dead in its tracks at the Battle of Tours, also known as the Battle of Poitiers. As Thomas Asbridge observes, Islamic forces had overwhelmed the Iberian Peninsula in 711. So dynamic was their advance that only the might of Charlemagne's grandfather, Charles the Hammer, could turn them back from the borders of France and the heartlands of Latin Christendom. Likewise, Karsh says, "Few events have transformed the course of human history more swiftly and profoundly than the expansion of early Islam and its conquest of much of the ancient world. Within 12 years of Muhammad's death in June 632, Iran's long-reigning Sassanid Empire had been reduced to a tributary, and Egypt and Syria had been wrested from Byzantine rule. By the early 8th century, the Muslims had extended their domination over Central Asia and much of the Indian subcontinent all the way to the Chinese frontier, had laid siege to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantines, and had overrun North Africa and Spain. Had they not been contained in northwest France by the nobleman Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers, they might well have swept deep into Europe. The Muslims had been stopped from proceeding further into Europe, but they were very far from being removed altogether. Strongly garrisoned throughout Muslim Spain, or Al-Andalus as it has come to be known, it would be quite a long time before the military power of Islam was altogether expelled from the European continent. Nevertheless, the legendary Battle of Tours has widely been hailed for centuries in European lore as an incredibly positive event that finally stayed the tide of Islamic expansion into Europe. As Raymond Ibrahim summarizes, of all the battles surveyed in this book, Tours has, beginning with the contemporary chronicles up until the modern era, been one of, if not the most celebrated in the West. For although the Mediterranean was lost, and although raids on the coastline became a permanent feature, Islam was confined to the Iberian Peninsula, leaving Western Europe to develop organically. Thus, well into the 12th century, many Western historians still saw Tours as one of the great events in the history of the world, as upon its issue depended whether Christian civilization should continue or Islam should prevail throughout Europe. However, this traditional narrative has been called into question by those with an ideological axe to grind against the West. A representative example here is David Levering Lewis, who, astonishingly, makes the following claim. The Battle of Poitiers was a pivotal moment in the creation of an economically retarded, balkanized, and fratricidal Europe that, by defining itself in opposition to Islam, made virtues out of hereditary aristocracy, persecutory religious intolerance, cultural particularism, and perpetual war. Most of history is indisputably written by the winners, yet winning at Poitiers actually meant that the economic, scientific, and cultural levels that Europeans attained in the 13th century could almost certainly have been achieved more than 3 centuries earlier had they been included in the Muslim world empire. One can scarcely believe that we live in an era where one would claim that it was, in fact, a bad thing that Europe repelled further Islamic expansion into Europe, and yet Lewis believes that it would have actually been a good thing if Europe had experienced an even greater degree of Islamic control. How can anyone seriously believe this? The answer lies in the fact that medieval Muslims in general, and Al-Andalus in particular, have been the beneficiaries of quite a bit of historical rewriting and good PR from modern liberals. Modern liberals have done quite a good job of subverting the traditional narrative, instead getting the message out that medieval Muslim Spain was actually a beacon of religious tolerance during a dark age. It is just taken for granted at this point by most non-experts that Jews, Christians, and Muslims were living in an enlightened, liberal, technologically advanced, religiously tolerant society which prospered while the intolerant Christian fundamentalists populating the rest of Europe wasted away throughout the Dark Ages. This is easily demonstrated by even the most casual look at the literature. For example, Karen Armstrong claims, when the Muslims conquered a people, they did not attempt to force conversion on their new subjects. Muhammad had given an eloquent example of the Islamic principle of the sanctity of the individual conscience when he conquered Mecca without bloodshed and put no pressure on the Meccans to convert. The Middle East had long been an area of religious pluralism, and the Arabs were used to religions existing alongside one another. The Muslim system was, therefore, rather more acceptable to many people than the policies of their predecessors. On the whole, Islam was a tolerant religion in practice despite its warlike theology. It encouraged a peaceful coexistence and found it quite possible to live side by side with other religions. Similarly, David Levering Lewis asserts that Islam in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, was generally religiously tolerant and, above all, economically robust. In the same vein, James Reston Jr. writes, in arts and agriculture, learning and tolerance, Al-Andalus was a beacon of enlightenment to the rest of Europe. Among its finest achievements was its tolerance. Jews and Christians were welcomed, if not as equals, then as full-fledged citizens. They were permitted to practice their faith and their rituals without interference. This tolerance was in keeping with the principles of the Quran, which taught that Jews and Christians were to be respected as peoples of the book. Likewise, Antonio Santosuosso claims that, at this time, Muslim rulers were well known for their tolerance of non-Muslims, Christians, or Jews as long as they obeyed the laws of the state and did not engage in proselytization. Andrew Wheatcroft gives a slightly more measured, but still overly rose-tinted picture of Al-Andalus, saying, "The population of Al-Andalus in the 9th century had four main elements: the Muslim conquerors, Arab or Berber, the Christian Mozarabs, and the Jews. For the most part, apart from the occasional outburst of mutual antagonism, all managed to live side by side." There is only one major flaw with this popular narrative. It's simply not supported by the extant evidence. Indeed, one of the major justifications for the First Crusade came from the abuses suffered by Christians at the hands of their Muslim overlords, who made them second-class citizens, excessively taxed them, forced them into slavery, both manual and sexual, and just generally made their lives miserable. The historical evidence overwhelmingly indicates that these reports were not made up, but reflected the day-to-day lives of Christians living under Muslim rule. As Rodney Stark puts it, a great deal of nonsense has been written about Muslim tolerance, that in contrast to Christian brutality against Jews and heretics, Islam showed remarkable tolerance for conquered people, treated them with respect, and allowed them to pursue their faiths without interference. It is true that the Quran forbids forced conversions; however, that recedes to an empty legalism, given that many subject peoples were free to choose conversion as an alternative to death or enslavement. That was the usual choice presented to pagans, and often Jews and Christians, who were faced with that option or with one only somewhat less extreme. In principle, as people of the book, Jews and Christians were supposed to be tolerated and permitted to follow their faiths, but only under quite repressive conditions. Death was, and remains, the fate of anyone who converted to either faith, nor could any new churches or synagogues be built. Jews and Christians also were prohibited from praying or reading their scriptures aloud, not even in their homes or in churches or synagogues, lest Muslims accidentally hear them. In some places, non-Muslims were prohibited from wearing clothing similar to that of Muslims, nor could they be armed. In addition, non-Muslims were invariably severely taxed compared with Muslims. This is not to say that the Muslims were more brutal or less tolerant than were Christians or Jews, for it was a brutal and intolerant age. It is to say that efforts to portray Muslims as enlightened supporters of multiculturalism are at best ignorant. It is, of course, true that Muslims generally did not insist that the peoples they conquered convert to Islam, but this had nothing to do with idealistic tolerance for other religions, and had everything to do with economics. Muslims were allowed to exact greater tax revenue from non-Muslims than from Muslims, and for that reason, they discouraged conquered peoples from embracing Islam. As Raymond Ibrahim says, Islam's three choices had come to Jews and Christians. Either they converted, died fighting, or kept their religions by paying extortion money and accepting an inferior position as dhimmis in Muslim society. Indeed, so excessive were these taxes on non-Muslims that conquered people often converted to Islam just to avoid paying them. At times, Muslim rulers had to actively ban conquered peoples from converting to Islam just so they could maintain their current levels of income. As Karsh points out, the Arab conquerors were far less interested in the mass conversions of the vanquished peoples than in securing their tribute. Not until the 2nd and 3rd Islamic centuries did the bulk of these populations embrace the religion of their latest imperial masters, and even this process emanated from below in an attempt to escape paying tribute and to remove social barriers, with the conquering ruling class doing their utmost to slow it down. In 2016, Darío Fernández-Morera published an excellent and important book titled The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, going through the primary sources in painstaking detail, exposing the sorts of atrocities perpetrated against Christians by their Muslim overlords. The reason why the idea that Al-Andalus was some sort of tolerant, multicultural utopia has prevailed, Morera argues, is not because this is supported by the extant evidence, but rather because this fits the modern narrative that the West is bad and Muslims are just misunderstood. As he explains, since the 18th century Enlightenment, the critical construction of a diverse, tolerant, and happy Islamic Spain has been part of an effort to sell a particular cultural agenda, which would have been undermined by the recognition of a multicultural society racked by ethnic, religious, social, and political conflicts that eventually contributed to its demise. A multicultural society held together by only the ruthless power of autocrats and clerics. This ideological mission would, then, be the ultimate reason for the tilting of the narrative against Catholic Spain. In the past few decades, this ideological mission has morphed into presentism, an academically sponsored effort to narrate the past in terms of the present, and thereby reinterpret it to serve contemporary multicultural, diversity, and peace studies, which necessitate rejecting as retrograde, chauvinistic, or worse, conservative, any view of the past that may conflict with the progressive agenda. Thus, it is stupendous to see how some academic specialists turn and twist to downplay religion as the motivating force in Muslim conquests, and even to question the invasion of Spain by Muslim Arab-led Berbers as the conquest of one culture and its religion by another. Failing to take seriously the religious factor in Islamic conquests is characteristic of a certain type of materialist Western historiography which finds it uncomfortable to accept that war and the willingness to kill and die in it can be the result of someone's religious faith, an obstacle to understanding that may reflect the role played by religious faith in the lives of many academic historians. This materialist approach has also generally prevailed in scholarly analyses of the Crusades. Obviously, time precludes me from detailing each and every example documented by Morera, but some of the more notable instances of Muslim persecution against Christians include the following. During the Muslim conquest of Spain, the Muslims would boil the corpses of the fallen Christians in stewing pots. While Christians interpreted this to mean that the Muslims were cannibals, many have argued that this was actually just a form of psychological warfare. Whatever the explanation, this type of intimidation tactic hardly makes Al-Andalus look like a tolerant utopia, as the earlier catena of authors suggested. Morera explains, as both Muslim and Christian sources attest, the Islamic forces were more ruthless and knew how to demoralize an enemy better than any army since the Roman conquest. Both Muslim and Christian sources mentioned a story that, even if apocryphal, illustrates the knowledge of the tactical use of terror in psychological warfare. Shortly after the Islamic forces landed, the flesh of the cadavers of some Christians killed in battle were boiled in large cauldrons under the sight of terrified Christian prisoners, who became convinced that the Muslims were cannibals. Now, of course, this was just a part of the strategy to conquer Spain in the first place, but the Muslims also made day-to-day life miserable for non-Muslims living in Al-Andalus. Women, of course, had no rights. They were forced to wear veils out in public. Female sexual slavery ran rampant, and any sexual impropriety was punishable by death even if the woman repented, as Morera explains. In Al-Andalus, the punishment for adultery against a free married Muslim female was stoning, and female circumcision was considered honorable. Most Arabists and other academic experts on Islamic studies, as well as popularizing writers, have studiously overlooked these and other such topics in their encomiastic accounts of this golden age of Islam. As Ibn Hazm explained, an adulteress, even one who was otherwise an exemplary Muslim, must be killed even if she repented. The extremely painful and backward practice of female circumcision, or female genital mutilation, was expected, if not required, for women living in Al-Andalus. As Morera puts it, the Muslim female circumcision, kifad, or lessening, was legal, taken for granted, and praiseworthy in Al-Andalus. Curiously, this cultural practice has not been pointed out in the general scholarly histories on the Islam of Al-Andalus. Even the best scholars have prudently tiptoed around it, yet several examples easily found in contemporary legal documents make the presence of female circumcision rather clear. He goes on to cite the Muwatta, the Risala, and the Leyes des Moros, which either prescribe or at least strongly encourage the circumcision of females living in Al-Andalus. And to be clear, female circumcision is not just some weird thing that we in the West don't practice but is utterly harmless. No, it is widely regarded as unsafe and unhealthy. The process itself, of course, is extremely painful, especially when performed in the medieval era, when effective anesthesia had not yet been developed. But beyond the initial pain and trauma, female circumcision is linked to higher risk of infections, sexually transmitted diseases, urinary incontinence, painful urinations, complications during childbirth, and chronic pain. Because of this, it is widely considered a human rights violation. Al-Andalus was essentially under Sharia law, and, of course, this came with strict prohibitions in almost all areas of life, as well as cruel punishments for violating these prohibitions, as Morera explains, emphasizing the self-discipline and control that were central to medieval Islam. Andalusian legal treatises lay out concrete rules governing virtually all aspects of an individual's daily life. For example, the rulers instructed males not to adorn themselves with jewels, or wear gold and silver rings, or other such ornaments, or wear clothes made of silk, or deform with tattoos God's given body, or drink in vessels of gold or silver, or have luxury objects made of gold and silver in their houses, or play dice or chess. Injunctions against drinking wine were in tune with other rules that imparted sobriety and strength to believers, but they took on special importance in Islamic Spain, given the large wine-drinking Christian population in Al-Andalus and in the neighboring Christian kingdoms. Documents from 10th century Umayyad Cordoba record double punishment against someone for both making and selling wine. Ibn Rashid points out that the consensus among jurists was to rely on Caliph Umar's views, according to whom the punishment for drunkenness was 80 lashes. Indeed, Al-Tafri prescribes 80 lashes for someone who drank an alcoholic beverage, whether or not the person got drunk. This last point about the Muslims severely punishing people for even drinking a small amount of wine seriously challenges the thesis that Al-Andalus was a bastion of religious tolerance, given that drinking communion wine was an absolutely essential component of the Catholic faith practiced by the Christians who were forced to live under this regime. By prohibiting them from drinking communion wine, the Muslims were absolutely restricting their freedom of religion. The restriction of religious freedom did not end with religious rituals, but also extended to religious worship, for music of all kinds was likewise strictly forbidden. Again, Morera reminds us, in Al-Andalus, the Maliki school of Islamic law forbade musical instruments and singing. Mutasibs had the power to enter a house if they heard string and wind instruments being played and break them up. Al-Kushani records that under the presumably tolerant Umayyad ruler Ibn al-Rahman III, highly respected judges ordered people's musical instruments confiscated and destroyed. These Andalusian judges were just diligently following Muslim religious teachings. The law in Al-Andalus did not apply equally to Muslims and Christians alike. This supposedly tolerant society explicitly prescribed harsher punishments for Christians than for Muslims for the exact same offenses. As Morera documents, explicit distinctions between Muslims and non-Muslims produced all sorts of consequences for the Christian demise. In Maliki jurisprudence, the blood money, the compensation for injury and some kinds of death, of a killed Christian was half that of a free Muslim. If a free Muslim killed a Christian, he must not be punished with death unless the killing had been treacherous, whereas the murder of a free Muslim could be punished with death. Injuries to Christians caused by Muslim slaves were also treated differently. The testimony of a Christian or a Jew was not valid in disputes between Muslims. The Pact or Covenant of Umar was a Muslim document that allowed Christians to practice their religion indoors and under severe restrictions in exchange for submission to Muslims and the payment of a protection tax, the jizya. This inequality was not just present in the application of the law, but also in the freedom to convert to another faith. Morera explains, the Utbidya confirms that if the children of a Muslim father and Christian mother wanted to become Christians, they must be forced to remain Muslims or be killed. The children born of an apostate, while the apostate was still a Muslim, must be forced to be Muslims, even if they did not wish to do so. And children born of an apostate, while the apostate was no longer a Muslim, and had survived to have children, must be forced to become Muslims if they had not yet reached puberty. A court document from 10th century Umayyad Cordoba confirms that Christians were forbidden from even walking across Muslim cemeteries because their walking by the Muslim tombs would pollute them. While theoretically, Christians were permitted to retain their faith in Al-Andalus, in practice, saying something as simple as that Jesus is God out loud could result in execution. Morera documents a case of this as follows. In 919, the head judge of tolerant Umayyad Cordoba invoked the punishment that contemporary Sharia law prescribes against a Christian woman accused and found guilty of having said publicly that Jesus was God and that Muhammad was a liar who had pretended to be a prophet. Whoever depreciates Allah, praised be Allah, or depreciates his messenger, peace be upon him, be he a Muslim or an infidel, he must be killed and must not be allowed to repent. One of the most common forms of execution in Al-Andalus was crucifixion, something that had been outlawed for centuries at this point in the Christian world. This method of execution served not only as an effective deterrent to politically subversive behavior, but it also served to mock and humiliate the Christian population. Morera explains, the servant of the merciful ingeniously varied his methods of killing. Spectacular crucifixions instead of simple beheadings were particularly effective when his soldiers failed in their duty. Ibn Hayyan describes a witness's horror at this mass crucifixion, a reaction which was undoubtedly Abd al-Rahman's intention to provoke. Death might not save an enemy from crucifixion. After the death of Ibn Hafsun, a rebel and apostate to Christianity, Abd al-Rahman III had his cadaver disinterred, crucified, and exposed as a Christian. This sort of crucifixion after death did not stop when the reign of the tolerant Umayyads ended. The Almoravids followed this Umayyad practice. Ibn Hayyan tells several interesting stories regarding Abd al-Rahman III's other personal inclinations. One tells of his burning the face of a beautiful female sexual slave who had dared reject his advances. The Muslims also created a booming slave economy in Al-Andalus, so much so that it was the sex slavery capital of the medieval world. Raymond Ibrahim observes, as other sources make clear, much Muslim plunder consisted of Christian women and children, for Muslims particularly valued blonde or red-haired Frank or Galician women as sexual slaves, so much so that Muslim Spain became a center for the trade and distribution of slaves to the rest of the Islamic world. Christian subjects were sometimes even required to make an annual tribute, not of money or horses or arms, but of 100 damsels, all to be distinguished for beauty, to ornament the harems. The primary sources don't exactly paint a picture of a tolerant society. Of course, some of the sources Morera draws from may be questionable, or one could argue that other interpretations of them are possible. But the point here is to draw attention to the sheer number of them. If one has to dismiss all of the earliest sources to avoid the conclusion that Al-Andalus was a hellhole governed by the strict enforcement of Sharia law, then they equally cannot claim to have any evidence that it was a tolerant paradise. As Morera concludes, one may disagree with and instinctively reject 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these sources, whose assertions contradict comfortable beliefs, or one may raise questions about what these testimonies really mean in order defensively to undermine their authority. But after a while, the sheer number of assertions from so many different sources becomes difficult to refute, and their cumulative effect even harder to dispel. The evidence is clear that the Muslims were not benevolent or tolerant rulers. Quite the contrary. The Europeans had every reason to fear and resist this expansion into Europe, and to liberate their Christian brothers and sisters who were suffering under Islamic oppression. Of course, Islamic barbarism was hardly limited to Al-Andalus. Islamic persecution of Christians was rampant throughout the Muslim world. To document every example of this would require a series of its own, but for the purposes of this video, I will just document some of the more egregious examples. Drawing from a range of early Christian and Islamic sources, Raymond Ibrahim recounts how the Muslims treated Christians during and after their conquest of Amorium, saying, about half of the city's 70,000 people were slaughtered and the rest hauled off in chains. There was such a surplus of human booty that when the Caliph came across 4,000 male prisoners, he ordered them executed on the spot. Because there were so many women's convents and monasteries in this populous Christian city, over 1,000 virgins were given to the Moorish and Turkish slaves so as to assuage their lust, laments the chronicler. One wonders if Mutasim had enticed his slaves beforehand by regaling them with stories of how Byzantine women, including nuns, were especially good at and eager to have intercourse, as Abbasid luminaries had claimed. Among the many slaves the Caliph carted off were 42 nobles, mostly from the military and clerical classes. During their lengthy captivity in Iraq, they were repeatedly ordered to accept Islam but refused. In 845, after 7 years of torture and temptation failed to make them renounce Christ for Muhammad, they were beheaded and their bodies dumped into the Euphrates River. He goes on to say, atrocities were not limited to Asia Minor or its indigenous Christians. As the Turks were ruling the lands of Syria and Palestine, they inflicted injuries on Christians who went to pray in Jerusalem, beat them, pillaged them, and levied the poll tax, jizya, writes Michael the Syrian. Moreover, every time they saw a caravan of Christians, particularly of those from Rome and the lands of Italy, they made every effort to cause their death in diverse ways. It is often suggested that it was only during these times when the Turks were running amok that Christians living around the Holy Land were persecuted. This is incorrect. Similar bouts of persecution regularly erupted under other Muslim peoples and dynasties from the very start. Thus, in the early 8th century, under the Umayyads, some Arabs captured, tortured, and executed 70 Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem for refusing to convert to Islam, minus 7 who had complied under torture. Shortly after that, another 60 pilgrims were crucified in Jerusalem. In the late 8th century, under the Abbasids, Muslims destroyed 2 churches and a monastery near Bethlehem and slaughtered the monks. In 796, Muslims burned another 20 monks to death. In 809 and again in 813, multiple monasteries, convents, and churches were attacked in and around Jerusalem. Christians of both sexes were gang raped and massacred. In 929, on Palm Sunday, another wave of atrocities broke out. Churches were destroyed and Christians slaughtered. In 936, the Muslims in Jerusalem made a rising and burnt down the Church of the Resurrection, the Holy Sepulchre, which they plundered and destroyed all they could of it, records one Muslim chronicler. That said, the persecution and carnage had reached apocalyptic levels by the 1090s. The Islamic doctrine of jihad was absolutely a driving force behind this barbaric treatment of Christians. This is made clear by the fact that the cruelty inflicted upon Christian populations went well beyond the sorts of abuse and humiliation common to warfare and conquest of that time. The Muslims, in particular the Turks, devised ingenious ways to mix the pain of their Christian subjects with forced acts of blasphemy and desecration. Ibrahim documents an example of this, saying, "Not only did the Muslim invaders defile the holy places in innumerable ways and destroy them, but they would circumcise Christian boys and youths above the Christian baptismal fonts, pour the blood from the circumcision into the fonts in mockery of Christ, force them to urinate on it, and then drag them around the church and force them to blaspheme the name and faith of the Holy Trinity. Those who refuse are subjected to various punishments and eventually killed. As for Christian women, the Muslim invaders took virgins and made them public prostitutes. Mothers were violated in the presence of their daughters, raped over and over again by different men, while their daughters were compelled not only to watch, but to sing obscene songs and to dance. Then they changed places, and the suffering, which is painful and shameful to speak of, was inflicted upon the daughters, while the filthy activity was adorned by the obscene songs of the unfortunate mothers." Now, I take no pleasure in recounting the details of these graphic episodes for viewers, but considering all the various ways in which the Crusaders have been unfairly demonized and maligned in popular culture, it's important that we have a crystal clear understanding of the situation facing Christians under Islamic rule, for that was one of the primary reasons that the Crusaders went to war against Islam. Despite claims by modern critics that these reports about Islamic atrocities were exaggerated, the primary sources give no indication of that. Rather, systemic persecution was a real and constant reality for Christians living under the rule of Sharia law. Prior to the call for the First Crusade in 1095, a movement very similar to the Crusades began in those parts of Spain that remained within Christian hands. History has come to remember this as the Reconquista, or the Reconquest. As the name implies, these wars against Muslims living in Spain were not seen as imperialistic conquests, but rather a taking back of lands which rightfully belonged to Christians. As Thomas Madden puts it, Spain was still Christendom, however, and Europeans believed strongly that Muslims should not be there. From their perspective, these lands were consecrated to Christ. It was not right that infidels should dwell there, let alone rule. Was it not self-evident that a Christian who fought to reclaim lands conquered by unbelievers was himself fighting for Christ? Thus it was in dealing with the Muslim presence in Spain that Western soldiers and theologians first cut their teeth on the idea of holy war. The Reconquista, or Reconquest, was the training ground for the theological and moral justification of the crusading movement. He concludes, like the Reconquista, the Crusades began as a result of a Muslim conquest. John France adds, the Spanish Reconquista has usually been seen by historians as a major precedent for the Crusade, providing Urban with a model and a point of reference for the rest of the Catholic lands. Likewise, Jonathan Riley Smith writes, as far as the liberation of people was concerned, therefore, Urban regarded the new crusade to the east as part of the wider movement of Christian liberation and did not distinguish it from the Spanish Reconquest. Because the Reconquista was seen as a holy war and set the example for the Crusades, it is false to claim, as Ergun and Emir Caner do, that the First Crusade was the first time in history that an army was gathered under the aegis of the cross of Jesus Christ, sanctified by the Pope to kill in the name of the Lord. Immediately prior to the launch of the First Crusade in 1095, the Christians in Spain began to see their efforts against the Muslims paying off. At around this time, Spain's most legendary knight, El Cid, came to prominence, defeating Muslim armies one after the other. As Weidenkopf narrates, in 1092, Alfonso VI, King of Leon Castile, recalled Spain's most famous knight from exile. With the king's permission, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, widely known as El Cid, raised an army and, after a 2-year siege, conquered Valencia on June 16, 1094. The Muslims reacted quickly, sending a very large field army to Valencia in December. To their surprise, El Cid did not accept a siege, but sallied forth and met the Muslim army at Coimbra, a town near Valencia. El Cid was a brilliant tactician who never lost a battle against Muslims, and in this instance, he conducted a daring night attack, inflicting a crushing and bloody defeat. Shortly thereafter, he squelched a revolt of Muslims in Valencia, expelling those involved, and taking revenge by turning Valencia's 9 mosques into Christian churches. In January 1097, El Cid defeated a new Muslim army sent against Valencia, meeting and beating them at the town of Beiran, and he then rode on to capture a number of other towns in the area. El Cid's resounding victories over major forces showed other Christian Spaniards what could be done. Although Islamic armies won some subsequent battles, the tide had turned. Islamic Spain was receding toward the southern coast. The Reconquista would continue for centuries, well after the Crusades in the Holy Land. But because it is often forgotten as setting a major precedent for the Crusades themselves, it deserves to be highlighted. From their inception, the Crusades were a response to literal centuries of aggressive Islamic expansion into Europe. Indeed, it is incredible that it took Europe 400 years to finally strike back against Islam. It is, therefore, unfair and inaccurate to characterize the Crusades as unprovoked imperialistic colonial expeditions by Western barbarians against their more enlightened and tolerant Muslim neighbors to the east. While this narrative might be popular and profitable for fostering anti-Western, anti-imperialistic sentiment, it is propaganda with no basis in history. This video has briefly examined the prehistory of the Crusades so as to contextualize them as a reactionary movement against the backdrop of 400 years of aggressive Islamic expansion. The purpose of this has been twofold. The first purpose has been to further correct popular myths about the Crusades, according to which they were unprovoked colonial efforts. The second purpose has been to set the stage for the positive argument of this entire series, according to which the Crusades were largely justified, meeting the criteria discussed in my last video for a just war. The argument, as we have seen, goes much deeper than merely asserting, well, they started it, like children fighting on a playground. Rather, our investigation has shown that Christians in Muslim lands were living under brutal persecution, and that this provides an adequate justification for the Knights of Europe to liberate their Christian brothers and sisters from the oppression of Islam. That is the first step in establishing the overall conclusion that the Crusades were, for the most part, just wars which deserve our appreciation rather than our condemnation.